Your AI doesn't need a better prompt. It needs a better manager. A lot of the advice around AI is about, go deploy my skill, or let's write a better prompt. And some of this can be actually kind of useful, but it focuses us, I think, on an older way of working with AI, which is about setting up rules and using it in a very, tightly controlled, what's called an inner loop, right? Where you're working with the AI very tightly, and you send it a prompt and it gives you a response. Maybe it does some agentic work for you. You're able to see those changes. That feels good, and you're able to sort of turn that way. But as a result, it's a tool that you're using. And there's a higher leverage way to look at it, which is as a, for lack of a better metaphor, an employee that works for you. And when you're asking, how do you manage an employee, you don't ask about how you can be sitting next to them all the time and be giving them immediate directives and getting things out, because there's no leverage in that. Instead, you look at the process. And the process is the essence of management. So Andy Grove was CEO of Intel, and he wrote a classic book on management called High Output Management back in the early 1980s. And I think many of us who are working with AI should be reading it and be thinking about AI from the point of view of management, particularly the insights he has about what effective management really is. And for him, effective management is not about micromanaging the person in front of you, trying to give them lots of rules that are going to hem in the way that they work. You want the people who you hire to be able to work on the mission. You want them to be trained, to be skilled, to be able to do that job, and then you want to release them to actually do it. But in the context of that, you have process. And process is the way we do business around here and the way that we do work. And what are the norms that say how we decide what good looks like? How do we report to each other? How do we get how do we get things done? And that's not just a list of rules or thou shalt nots. It's a list of norms. And part of what he talks about as being the job of a senior leader, of being a manager, is to figure out how to be better engineering that process, to be providing, rules that serve as guardrails and norms that enhance what people can do. Because when you are working with a tool, you are trying to put the tool in the right position, and the work from there is entirely mechanical. But when you're working with people, especially knowledge workers, what you're trying to do is give them the room to use their maximum intelligence. And AI kind of sits somewhere in the middle between these. And we're all discovering what the new model is that's going to work with us. But I think that these ideas of management are really going to be the most useful category, more than just, trying to lock the tool correctly into the machine. And by elevating to the level of management, we're able to get a lot more out of the system. So a tool needs to be operated, and pretty much step by step. Whereas a doer can receive a task or sort of a compound task of do this, then this, then this, and this, and use your judgment as we sort of, get through these things. There are levels where like a task that has, sufficiently, well specified, parameters can be done mechanically, right? And can start to look more like the doer. But the thing is, where the doer really adds value is going to be that judgment that's sitting at these various points. And that means giving a better idea of how to apply that judgment is going to be what creates the maximum value for you, right? And then you want the doer to be then using the tools. Now, this only works well if you don't need to be hovering over it all the time. Otherwise, the doer might as well be a tool. The employee that you sit next to all the time in order to make sure that they're doing the right stuff is not actually providing you with a multiplier on your time. And for that matter, you're not getting the maximum value out of that person because they haven't been trained, right? They don't know how to do things. They don't know what good is. One of the highest jobs we have when we are working with doers as opposed to tools is we're trying to train them and educate them so that they can become, compounding better resources, whereas tools remain tools. right? You can sharpen your saw, but it'll never be more than a sharp saw. A doer can continue to grow and do more. The extraordinary thing is AI starts to look more like that. It looks more like that every day. I'm not sure I would have said this about AI like, I don't know, even 6 months ago, but it is something I'm saying about AI today in terms of where the most valuable work is. To be treating it more like a doer, more like a direct report, rather than a tool that you're holding in your hand and controlling mechanically.
Just a very quick ask. If you're finding this useful and interesting, I hope you'll like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you have, please tell other people about it. It helps spread the word about what we're doing here and help other people learn more about what's really interesting about the hard parts of AI.
So the level of supervision that a given agent, right, is going to need is a little bit like the level of supervision you have for someone you're hiring for the task. Right, it's going to be based on their maturity in their education, right? Like the way you need to manage, say, a teenager who's coming in from high school and getting their first job is a little bit different from the way you treat someone who is in their 40s, right? Is going to be based on their maturity in terms of their education. Someone who's had a collegiate or post-collegiate education, is going to have a different set of understanding than someone who is less so. And also in terms of the task, right? How good are they at the particular domain that we're working on right here, and how good are they at working with you, which is also about trust. So these all feed into a dial, right, of how much supervision you think a given agent or given AI subsystem is going to need. And so the what this all means though is that these are all moving targets, right? It's a dial that not only you turning on the supervision, but they're turning in terms of their maturity. And there's a line about how like every few months you should be throwing out your old rules and whatever as you're working with AI systems, and there's a lot to be said for that because the models themselves get better, and your insights of how to share with these systems also gets better, right? Because those skills that you created a few months ago are based on your understanding from a few months ago, and so you want to both be looking at how these things are getting smarter for you. Right. And like, when you're watching this video, how does that compare with the video that might have or the AI that would have been present when I first recorded this? How much smarter is it, in general? How much smarter is it relative to your particular domain? Right now, models are pretty good at code, but, produce a good deal of slop. And sort of the more frontiery thing is what I call cognitive code in terms of documentation to be creating procedures, right? To start to be able to manage each other, which is a super cool place to be, by the way. But you want to be watching where that's going. And then you want to be paying attention to how your own set of rules, incentives, what have you, are going to be helpful. Just like, your training for your employees is, your employees themselves are changing, and your, and the training documents, right? The rules, the standard operating procedures, these all need to be evolving as well. The dial moves both ways. They're changing, you're changing what you're giving them. And in that is going to be where we can really get a lot of extraordinary value at the process level. You want to fix the product and not just the artifact. And I totally sympathize with how frustrating it can be when AI builds the wrong thing. When it goes off in the wrong direction. You're like, man, this is terrible. I could have done this faster myself. How many times have I said that about an employee? And just like with that, we need to ask, like, what's the real asset here, right? If it would be fast, if it would be better for you just to do it yourself, of course you should just do it yourself. But the opportunity here is to teach, right? The teachable moment. And teachable moments can definitely apply to AI. And that's where fixing the process really comes in. Because not just about saying, this is a terrible thing. Don't you see why this is a terrible thing? I mean, you're going to need to explain more about why this is a terrible thing. But then more importantly, you need to understand how to get to that, right? So you need to be able to, like, for example, name, what failed. What was the problem here, right? And then I will often ask the AI to, go back. Hey, what directives did you have? What did we have in our harness? What did we have in the skills we used? Like, where in your thinking process did you think this was a good idea to do? And one of the great things about AI is that all of its thinking is explicit. Like, unlike humans, where our thinking is a little bit more mushy behind what we actually say and write, all the thinking that the AI does is all sitting in those reasoning tokens. It can go back and look. It can say, oh, well, this is what I thought, and this is why I did it, and this is where I got it from. This is super, super helpful, because now you get a better idea of like where the thinking process is coming from. And this means that you can be deciding, what you want to be changed. Not just changed to fix this particular issue, but like, how did it think about the problem wrong? This is where I spend a lot of my time. I'll talk more about that in a second. But this is where I find the greatest value to be, right? You can be using your harness, like your agents.md file. It's a great place to be keeping, ideas about processes. I call them norms, right? What are important? What are sort of the North Stars that will cause it to say this is the right way to do things? Having skills. Now, one way to build a skill is going to be these recipes for exactly how you do X, right? And sort of the classic example is like, the Matrix, where Neo says, "I know Kung Fu," and the and the idea that like what you learned is something mechanical. But the truth is, if you learn Kung Fu, what you're really learning about is like a way of thinking about the relationship between you and your body, the way you think about your body relative to space and relative to your opponent. These ways of thinking are, to my mind, the most powerful ways to be using skills and to be using the harness. The more mechanical something is, the more it actually belongs in code that can be invoked by the AI. Where the AI adds more value is going to be through the norms, and that's going to be through the process. The more we teach it better process, the more we give it better ways of thinking about the process, the more leverage we're going to get. So when I started working with AI, it was very much me writing code, doing things, and then the AI was able to make some suggestions, right? Like, amped up autocomplete. That's sort of the GitHub Copilot days. And then ramp that up to, say, Cursor, which is able to do even more work, being able to identify what problems there are. You're able to give it a prompt using sort of the sidebar or whatever, and then it could create, significant chunks of code so that if I knew what I was trying to do with some degree of specificity, it could actually go make the code that did it, and that would allow me to, get a good deal of leverage. But all these things are relatively, marginal improvements. But where things really get exciting is when I started lifting myself from I'm inside the project, to working on the project and working across the project. And that really is about shifting my attention from what's happening inside like a given repository project to being able to go at the level of, if you will, the culture or the operating model of the business. And so, my focus now is what's the right thing to be going into these harness level skills? What's the right thing to go into the harness level, launcher, right? The agents MD file, right? So that it has better context and can be thinking better about what, good way of work is. And so when I am doing work with the AI and reviewing its work, my question is, where did the process come from? Why did you do this? Not, what's the problem here? Because it can find there are problems. But like, where did it come from? How do we think about this? And then being able to step back to ask, is there something we should be changing up in our, up at that harness level, right? At that business level. Because then the insights I have are going to be going across the whole organization, right? Across multiple projects, instead of just being focused on the thing that's inside the one, right? Because any given project is going to reward technical insight for how to do X. But going across the projects will allow us to ask, how do we want AI to be working for us? And how do we want it to do better? And the thing is, that second category is something that would not have been valuable when I was getting started, right? Using, the Copilot or Cursor or whatever, but it becomes much more valuable today because the models are bigger and because they're ready for thinking about the problems. That's what I find to be absolutely the most valuable. Now, part of this also gets into how I have it do work for me, right? I have it do what I call a graveyard shift. where it will work on multiple issues for me over a longer period of time, right? Not like working on, say, one PR or one issue or whatever, but like give it a whole set of problems that I've been thinking about, or that we've been, iterating on. Not just like, one PRD, but a whole set of, potential things to do. And then it looks at them together and works on them, fires off various sub-agents that will work on them individually. But then by bringing them back to me in the form of a brief of like, these are the multiple initiatives I did, I'm bringing this back to you, and here's how they fit together. Then the conversation I can be having is elevated above, right, what any of these tasks are, and be looking at, as if the AI agent that I'm having a conversation with, the orchestrating agent, if you will, is kind of like the general manager for this functional group or this department or this line of business or whatever. And by having it look at multiple issues and multiple projects all at the same time, it shifts our discussion necessarily from how do you do X to how do we think about this set of stuff. And that idea of how we think about it, that's what really needs to go into our, harnesses and skills and whatever that are at the top level, because that adds the most value. The technical knowledge can definitely is important, of course, but is often the kind of thing that is handled at like the individual project level. The question of what should happen at the business level, right, that goes across projects, that's going to be where you can bring more of your insight and where you can make it a better, proxy, right, for your judgment, and make something that actually gives you a lot more leverage, not just as an executor, but also as a decision maker. So this is your economic opportunity. The models will keep on getting better. They will get smarter. They will be more cognitive, for lack of a better term, right? And that this will make everything that's done with them that is mechanical, right? Like trying to put tight harnesses on them, those tight harnesses are going to fail repeatedly because you're putting, harnesses on all these different horses. In fact, then they stop being horses. They start being something else. The harnesses are just a bad fit. But management is a new domain that the AIs are not trained themselves in. Everything that I've been seeing about how AI works is about making them into better coders, better programmers, better knowledge workers, right? But they're working as ICs. The management opportunity is to be thinking about how we can fit this all into, the bigger process of the business. And that discipline is emerging and is completely separate from where the AI models and where those companies seem to be. So instead of focusing your attention on like filling various holes in the model, right? Like, okay, well, let's make sure it doesn't make this kind of mistake again, because that kind of mistake is, going to be fixed, right? The leaky memory or whatever, right? These huge companies are spending a lot of money making the models better and also making their top level harnesses better. But work spent improving the process in terms of how your business works with AI, that will provide continuous and compounding benefits.